March 14, 1982, Little Italy, New York City. Rain fell in heavy sheets. Neon signs flickered above empty streets. A black Cadillac idled under a street lamp, engine growling like a restrained animal. Inside, Giovanni "Johnny" Russo sat alone. His hands shook as he lit a cigar. Not from fear, but habit. The city had taught him caution. Suddenly, a shadow moved across the wet pavement. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. A gunshot shattered the night. Giovanni's body slumped into the leather seat. Silence followed. At first, the world assumed a routine mob hit, territorial dispute, retaliation, business gone bad. But the truth was stranger. Someone inside his inner circle had orchestrated it. Someone he trusted. Someone who owed him everything. 6 months later, that same man vanished in an explosion outside a Brooklyn warehouse. His betrayal returned to him in fire and smoke. What drove a loyal capo to turn murderer? And why did fate answer 6 months later with its own brutal justice? The answers lie not just in vengeance, but in the fragile architecture of power, loyalty, and fear inside the American Mafia of the early 1980s. Giovanni "Johnny" Russo was born on July 7, 1945 in the Bronx. The son of Sicilian immigrants, his early years were defined by the cramped tenements and relentless grind of post-war New York. His father worked long hours in a butcher shop. His mother stitched clothing in the kitchen by lamplight. Survival was taught early, not as philosophy, but as necessity. From an early age, Giovanni observed power in its rawest form, not in politicians or businessmen, but in the men who walked the streets with confidence and authority. Neighborhood elders, street enforcers, and local fixers carried influence through fear and respect. To a boy, their code was absolute. Loyalty was currency. Betrayal was death. By his teenage years, Giovanni's reputation had begun to form. Small crimes, a stolen wallet here, a brawl over a neighborhood dispute there, taught him precision and patience. He was not reckless. Observation, calculation, and timing became his tools. Friends called him clever. Enemies would later call him ruthless. At 20, he formally entered the Luciano crime family under the tutelage of a seasoned capo. His rise was methodical. Protection rackets, loan sharking, and subtle intimidation. Each move was measured. Every action had consequences. Giovanni's psychological profile was complex. Outwardly charismatic, inwardly detached. He could charm politicians and enforcers alike, but he harbored a quiet obsession with control. Loyalty was demanded, not requested. Yet he often overestimated it. Trust was his currency and his vulnerability. By the late 1970s, Giovanni had earned a reputation as both a strategist and an executor. His decisions were surgical, his punishments swift. Yet the same instinct that made him formidable, his unwavering trust in those closest to him, would eventually seed the betrayal that cost him his life. By 1972, Giovanni Russo had solidified his position within the Luciano family. He was no longer a street soldier. He was a capo, commanding respect and fear. The family's hierarchy was strict. The boss dictated strategy, capos executed, soldiers enforced. Giovanni excelled at both execution and strategy. His operations spanned gambling dens in Manhattan, union rackets in Brooklyn, and nightclubs in Queens. Each enterprise reinforced his influence. Politicians and local law enforcement began to notice him, not for charity, but for his reach. Bribes flowed, favors were owed, and silently the city bent around him. Giovanni was a master of perception. To the public, he was a respectable businessman. To associates, he was a mentor. To rivals, he was untouchable. Yet his rise was not without friction. Within the family, alliances were fragile. Capos jockeyed for position, always measuring loyalty against ambition. It was in this web that Salvatore "Sal" Vitale emerged, a lieutenant entrusted with Giovanni's inner operations. Charismatic, disciplined, and loyal, or so it seemed. Sal mirrored Giovanni's own early trajectory, street-smart, calculating, ambitious. He learned quickly, watching his mentor navigate power, influence, and subtle intimidation. By the late 1970s, Giovanni had become indispensable. He was the voice of strategy in the family, resolving disputes that might otherwise erupt into violence. Yet the same trust that had fueled his rise created cracks. Salvatore, once a protege, began to test boundaries, quietly questioning orders and exploring alliances outside the family. Meanwhile, political winds shifted.
The Mafia's grip on unions and city contracts faced scrutiny from federal investigations. Giovanni recognized the danger, but so too did Sal, opportunity for advancement in the shadows of instability. The seeds of betrayal were planted quietly, almost imperceptibly. The capo who had once commanded loyalty now faced the slow erosion of it from the one closest to him. In the Mafia, trust is measured in months, not years, and Giovanni would soon learn its true cost. By 1978, Giovanni Russo's empire was thriving, but the foundations beneath it were shifting. The city itself was changing. Federal authorities had begun aggressive investigations into organized crime. Union corruption cases made headlines. Politicians, once pliable, were increasingly cautious.
Giovanni sensed the pressure, but remained confident. He believed his network of loyal capos and soldiers would insulate him. Yet cracks began to appear, not in his strength, but in his inner circle. Salvatore Vitale, the once trusted lieutenant, grew bolder. He questioned decisions in private meetings, subtly undermined Giovanni's authority, and began forming his own network within the family. Small favors, whispered conversations, discreet alliances outside the family, steps invisible to all but the most attentive. The turning point came in June 1979, during a meeting over a disputed gambling territory in Brooklyn. Giovanni intended to assert dominance, reinforcing his authority. But Salvatore, seated nearby, subtly shifted allegiances. Soldiers who had once obeyed Giovanni without question hesitated. Orders were delayed. Rumors were whispered. That same summer, a high-stakes union contract fell through, not through law enforcement, but through internal mismanagement. Giovanni's decision had been overridden by silent dissent within his ranks. Salvatore had influenced the vote behind closed doors, signaling to rivals that Giovanni's grip was weakening. Giovanni recognized the betrayal, but only in fragments. He underestimated the patience and cunning of his lieutenant. The seeds of his eventual murder were not violent confrontations. They were moments like this: hesitation, misdirection, quiet disobedience. By the end of 1979, Giovanni's confidence had waned. The capo who had once dictated terms now watched closely, suspecting enemies where none openly existed. Loyalty, he realized, was not granted, it was earned every day, and even then, it could be borrowed by ambition. The Mafia's hierarchy was unforgiving. One misstep, one underestimated ally, could set the stage for death, and for Giovanni, that misstep had already begun. By 1980, Giovanni Russo's world had expanded beyond the streets of New York. The Mafia's reach into politics was no secret, yet few understood the depth. Through unions, construction contracts, and city contracts, the family manipulated decisions at every level. Jobs, permits, and even election outcomes could be influenced with the right pressure or the right threat. Giovanni had always been cautious, maintaining a careful balance between visible respectability and covert control. But now, federal investigations into organized crime had intensified. The RICO Act was reshaping the legal landscape, enabling prosecutors to target not just acts of violence, but the networks that enabled them. Every public move, every private meeting carried risk. Salvatore Vitale recognized this shift as opportunity, while Giovanni focused on containment, tightening internal security, auditing accounts, and vetting loyalties. Salvatore cultivated relationships with city councilmen, union leaders, and even federal informants. Quietly, he positioned himself as a bridge between factions, a seemingly loyal lieutenant who could protect Giovanni's interests while secretly weakening them. Meanwhile, political pressures compounded Giovanni's dilemma. Key allies and unions were subpoenaed, contracts were frozen, and rival factions in the family sensed weakness. The media began reporting on mafia influence in labor unions, casting shadows over legitimate business fronts. Giovanni's carefully constructed image of untouchability began to erode, not through direct violence, but through exposure and political scrutiny. By the spring of 1981, Giovanni understood the stakes. His empire could survive internal dissent, but not if the city, the law, and his own lieutenant conspired, whether overtly or subtly, to undermine him. Every handshake, every meeting, every public smile now masked a hidden calculation. Loyalty had a price, and betrayal was closer than he imagined. The stage was set. Political pressure, law enforcement scrutiny, and internal ambition converged. The man Giovanni had trusted above all others was ready to strike. By late 1981, Giovanni Russo's network had begun to fray. The capo who had once commanded unquestioned loyalty now found himself navigating invisible currents of suspicion. Soldiers hesitated, meetings ran late, and whispers followed him in hallways he once ruled with certainty. Isolation was subtle yet relentless. Salvatore Vitale had perfected the art of invisibility. Outwardly, he was the dutiful lieutenant,
the man who executed orders without question, but in private he orchestrated a web of influence that subtly eroded Giovanni's authority. Capos who had once aligned with Giovanni began to doubt, often citing minor grievances or strategic disagreements. Every misstep, every perceived weakness was magnified. Giovanni noticed. Paranoia crept like fog into his mind. He demanded loyalty tests, convened emergency meetings, and scrutinized communications. Yet the betrayal was invisible, so well hidden that Giovanni could not definitively identify the threat. The more he probed, the more cautious his men became. Salvatore's manipulation was surgical. He built doubt without confrontation, creating fractures that seemed natural. At the same time, outside pressures mounted. Federal investigations loomed larger, union contracts were contested, and rival families watched carefully. Giovanni's position in the hierarchy was precarious, not because of strength lost, but because trust had been weaponized against him. By early 1982, Giovanni was increasingly alone. His closest advisors, once loyal, now deferred subtly to Salvatore's counsel. Friends he had known since adolescence became distant. He had underestimated the capacity for calculated betrayal within his own circle.
The stage for his downfall was complete. Isolation had hardened, suspicion had blinded him, and ambition had found its target. The man he had once called protégé, the man he had trusted with his life, was now poised to deliver the ultimate strike. The Mafia's world, ruthless and cyclical, prepared to repeat itself, loyalty rewarded only by the cold calculus of consequence. It was March 14, 1982, the night the city would witness the deadly culmination of months of plotting. Giovanni Russo, unaware of the depth of betrayal surrounding him, arrived at a Brooklyn warehouse. A routine meeting, he thought, a discussion about union disputes and territory realignment. The warehouse was silent except for the hum of an idling black Cadillac outside. Rain slicked the pavement, reflecting neon lights like shards of glass. Soldiers moved methodically, each step measured, their faces hidden under hats and collars. Inside, Giovanni noticed Salvatore Vitali waiting. The lieutenant's presence offered comfort, a false reassurance. Minutes passed, conversation flowed, but beneath every word, tension rippled. Giovanni's instincts, sharp as ever, sensed something was off, but he could not place it. One soldier excused himself. Another fiddled with crates near the entrance. Each movement was deliberate, choreographed. Then the signal. Gunfire erupted. Giovanni barely had time to react. Bullets shattered wood and glass. Chaos enveloped the warehouse. The man who had once been his trusted lieutenant now directed the strike from the shadows. Salvatore's betrayal was total, absolute, precise. Giovanni fell. Blood pooled across the leather seat he had once occupied with authority and confidence. The life he had meticulously built ended in a few brutal seconds. Outside, the Cadillac's engine roared to life. 6 months later, the same man who orchestrated this murder vanished in an explosion outside a Brooklyn storage facility, a violent echo of the cycle he had set in motion. Fire consumed him, leaving nothing but ash and suspicion. Loyalty, ambition, and betrayal had collided with inevitability. In the Mafia, trust is fragile, power is temporary, and vengeance, often, is the only law that never fails. Giovanni Russo's death sent shockwaves through New York's underworld. The Luciano family, though disciplined, faced immediate uncertainty. Soldiers who had once operated under Giovanni's command hesitated, unsure of how to act without his presence. Territory disputes ignited quietly, a low simmer of tension that threatened to boil over. Law enforcement, long aware of Giovanni's influence, intensified investigations. Federal agents traced connections between the murder and the subsequent explosion that claimed Salvatore Vitali. The pattern was clear. Betrayal and retribution were inseparable in the Mafia's world. Yet evidence was scarce. Both deaths, though public in violence, were nearly impossible to prosecute definitively. Within the family, a power vacuum emerged. Capos jockeyed for position, balancing ambition with fear. Some aligned with surviving loyalists, others quietly sought leverage with outside factions. The delicate hierarchy Giovanni had maintained splintered under the weight of suspicion. Every handshake became measured, every conversation a potential trap. Public perception was equally complex. News reports hinted at mafia violence and corruption, but the full story remained obscured. Citizens saw headlines of murders and explosions, but not the intricate web of loyalty, manipulation, and political influence that had led to them. Giovanni's death became part of the city's grim undercurrent, a symbol of the hidden consequences of organized crime. Ultimately, the aftermath illustrated a brutal truth. In the Mafia, survival is fragile, power is fleeting, and betrayal is both inevitable and invisible. Even a figure as meticulous as Giovanni Russo could be undone from within, leaving only a legacy of fear, respect, and haunting unanswered questions. The streets returned to their rhythm, indifferent to the blood that had been shed, carrying forward the cycle of ambition and vengeance. Giovanni Russo's story begins and ends in the same rain-soaked streets of Brooklyn, yet the lessons echo far beyond neon reflections and shattered glass. Loyalty and betrayal, ambition and survival, power and fear, they are not abstract concepts in the Mafia. They are laws, unspoken yet absolute, binding every action to consequence. In the underworld, trust is currency, but fragile. Giovanni's greatest strength, his ability to command loyalty, became his vulnerability. His downfall was not sudden, it was a slow erosion, a meticulous manipulation by the one he had raised, the one he had trusted most. Betrayal is rarely loud. It whispers, it waits, it exploits the spaces no one notices. The cycle of violence that consumed both Giovanni and Salvatore illustrates a timeless truth. Power is temporary, ambition relentless, and revenge inevitable. 6 months separated the murder and the explosion, but in essence, the two events were mirrors, different reflections of the same human impulses. One act of betrayal breeds another. One violent decision echoes into the lives of all connected. This story returns to its beginning, to the black Cadillac idling under the rain, the neon lights flickering above. Giovanni's life, meticulously constructed, collapsed under the weight of human frailty, trust misplaced, ambition unchecked, loyalty misunderstood. In the end, the Mafia teaches that nothing lasts forever. Not empires, not friendships, not lives. All that remains is the imprint of choices, the shadow of consequences, and the haunting reminder that in the pursuit of power, every hand extended in loyalty carries the risk of a dagger. And so, the streets remember, not the names, but the cycle, not the lives, but the inevitability. The lesson is as old as ambition itself. Trust cautiously, act deliberately, and understand that every betrayal carries its own unrelenting price.